Welcome back. Go ahead and get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe flop face first into your pillow like a medieval peasant who just gave up on life. Tonight, we're diving into something truly soothing pandemics. Yeah, you heard me right. Nothing says bedtime comfort quite like a list of global diseases that wiped out millions of people. But don't worry, we're not here to panic. We're here to float through history in that slow, meandering way where you almost forget what century you're in. So let's just breathe in and let's drift back to a time before antibiotics, before hand sanitizer, before that one kid on the bus sneezing directly into your eyeballs. We're going to explore some of history's greatest hits in the death by germ department. And spoiler alert, most of them were made worse by people being, well, people. All right, let's start with the classic, the one everyone thinks about when they hear the word plague, the Black Death. Europe, mid 1300s. You know it, you love it. The Black Death, the medieval pandemic that really put death into the Middle Ages. Historians estimate it wiped out somewhere between 75 to 200 million people worldwide. And honestly, when your numbers are that big, it kind of stops mattering, doesn't it? Like, do we really need the precise figure when entire villages just ceased to exist? The culprit, of course, was Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas, living on rats, who hitched rides on ships and wagons. Essentially, rats were the world's first budget airlines. When the Black Death arrived in Europe around 1347, people didn't really know what germs were, or hygiene, or basic common sense. Their medical theory of choice was miasma, bad air. As in, if you smell something gross, congratulations, you just inhaled the plague. Which, honestly, is not that far off if you've ever walked past a dumpster in August. But people didn't just shrug. They had solutions. One option was to carry flowers, herbs, or spices around in little pouches because clearly lavender sachets were going to stop a bacterium. And then there were the doctors and those iconic bird masks stuffed with fragrant herbs to filter the air. Imagine waking up with a fever, then seeing a man in a crow costume hovering over you. Comforting. Totally relaxing. And let's not forget the good old-fashioned strategy of blaming minorities. Jewish communities, for instance, were accused of poisoning wells, which led to horrific massacres. Because apparently, nothing solves a plague like killing your neighbors. Humanity at its finest. The death toll was so severe that entire towns vanished. Labor shortages shook up feudalism, giving peasants bargaining power for once. Which means, in a weird roundabout way, the Black Death sort of jump-started modern economics. It's like history's most depressing productivity hack. Let's float over to ancient times. But the Black Death wasn't the first big pandemic. Nope. If we glide back more than 1,000 years, we land in ancient Athens, around 430 BCE, right in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. Perfect timing. This one's called the Plague of Athens. Historians still debate what it actually was. Typhus, smallpox, measles, maybe a particularly bad flu. Whatever it was, it killed about a third of Athens' population, which, if you're in the middle of a war with Sparta, is not ideal. Thucydides, the historian who chronicled it, actually survived the plague himself. So we've got a front row description. People with fevers, coughing up blood, skin ulcers, total exhaustion, and here's the really nice bedtime detail. A burning thirst so severe that people would throw themselves into wells. Athens was overcrowded because everyone had crammed inside the city walls for safety during the war. Sanitation was non-existent. Imagine Thousands of sweaty, unwashed bodies packed together in the summer heat. And then add whatever mystery virus this was. It's basically the ancient version of a cruise ship outbreak, but without shuffleboard or buffets. The fallout. Athens lost a massive portion of its army and population, and the war against Sparta became unwinnable. So you could say this little pandemic helped reshape Greek history, because apparently, even 2,400 years ago, a bad flu season could ruin your entire democracy. The Antonine Plague. Next up, the Antonine Plague, which hit the Roman Empire in 165 CE. This one might have also been smallpox or measles, or honestly, pick your favorite deadly virus. The story goes that Roman soldiers fresh from campaigns in the East brought it back with them, because nothing says, "Thank you for your service," like infecting half the empire. It lasted for nearly 2 decades. Millions of people died, including co-emperor Lucius Verus, which left his co-emperor Marcus Aurelius, yes, the philosopher king, to handle things alone. And if you've ever read his meditations, you can practically feel the stress oozing out of those stoic little diary entries. Like, remember, death is natural. Also, my empire is falling apart. Some historians think this pandemic might have killed as many as 5 million people, and it definitely weakened Rome. Fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, less food production. So the whole empire got a little more wobbly, which, when you're Rome, is not exactly a great look. The Plague of Justinian. Okay, now we're floating to the 6th century CE. Welcome to Constantinople. Emperor Justinian is sitting on his throne, trying to restore the glory of Rome, when suddenly, plague, again, because history has no chill. The plague of Justinian hit in 541 CE, caused by the same bacterium as the Black Death. That's right, Yersinia pestis was doing world tours long before the Middle Ages. This was basically its debut album. Reports claim the disease killed up to 10,000 people a day in Constantinople at its peak. 10,000 a day. Corpses piled up in the streets. The smell was unbearable. People were tossed into mass graves or just shoved into abandoned buildings when there was no room left. And poor Justinian himself, he caught the plague. He survived, but barely. Which is unfortunate for him because while he was convalescing, the empire was collapsing under the weight of death, famine, and chaos. By the time it was over, the plague of Justinian may have killed 25 to 50 million people across the empire and beyond, which is staggering. Imagine trying to run an empire while a third of your population just evaporates. Some historians argue that if this plague hadn't happened, the Byzantine Empire might have reconquered the West and restored Rome. Instead, they just limped along. Thanks, germs. Okay, deep breath, let's unclench. So far, we've covered a cheerful parade of humanity's worst days. But remember, we're here for cozy vibes. So picture this: a medieval town square, totally empty, birds chirping, rats scurrying, a single flag flapping in the breeze. Relaxing, right? Good, because up next, we're drifting into some of the other greatest hits. Smallpox, humanity's frenemy. Ah, smallpox, the slow burn disaster that kept coming back for centuries. Unlike the plague, which showed up in terrifying bursts, smallpox was more like that one relative who refuses to leave the party. Ever. It's hard to even estimate how many millions died of smallpox over the centuries. Some historians suggest it killed more people than all wars combined, which is quite the resume. In Europe, outbreaks happened regularly. Survivors were often left scarred, sometimes blinded. If you were lucky, you got lifelong immunity. If you weren't, well, royalty wasn't immune either. In fact, smallpox killed Louis XV of France, among others, which shows that even when you're living in a gilded palace, disease doesn't care. But the real kicker was when smallpox reached the Americas after European contact. Indigenous populations had zero immunity, and entire civilizations were devastated. We're talking mortality rates of 50 to 90% in some regions. It's hard to overstate how catastrophic that was. And yet, smallpox is also the first disease humans actually managed to eradicate. Thanks to vaccination. Shout out to Edward Jenner, who figured out that a little cowpox could save lives. The last known natural case was in 1977. Humanity, 1. Smallpox, billions. But hey, we'll take the win. And that feels like a good place to pause for part 1. We floated through Athens, Rome. All right, welcome back. Still breathing, still cozy. If part 1 was all about medieval rats and emperors coughing themselves into oblivion, part 2 is where things get a little more modern. Not exactly good news modern, but at least the germs start taking steamboats instead of donkey carts. So let's stretch, roll our shoulders, and float gently into the 19th century. Cholera, the serial killer of the 1800s. Ah, yes, cholera. The bacteria that single-handedly ruined water fountains for everyone. Unlike the slow burn elegance of smallpox, cholera was fast, brutal, and a little undignified. Symptoms included vomiting, leg cramps, and the big one, diarrhea so extreme it could kill you in hours, which is not the glamorous kind of death history usually memorializes. Imagine being an 1840s poet, dying not in a tragic duel, but in the bathroom. Cholera first exploded out of the Ganges Delta in the early 1800s, then went full world tour. We're talking pandemic after pandemic, sweeping across Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. At least 7 global waves by most counts. Each time, millions of people died, and each time, authorities tried to explain it away with, you guessed it, miasma. Bad air again. Cities reeked. Water supplies were basically open sewers, and officials were shocked when drinking from the Thames turned out to be a bad idea. But here's the plot twist. Cholera helped modernize public health. Enter Jon Snow. No, not the moody guy from Game of Thrones, but an English physician who in 1854 mapped out cholera cases around a water pump in Soho. He famously removed the pump handle and cases plummeted. It was one of the earliest proofs that diseases spread through contaminated water, not mysterious air vibes. Public sanitation eventually improved. Cities built sewer systems. And yet, cholera kept popping up. Because apparently, humans need to relearn the don't drink poop water lesson every few decades. Cholera is still around today, by the way, mostly in regions with poor sanitation or disaster zones. It's not medieval, it's not gone. It's just waiting for the next bad infrastructure week. The Spanish flu, history's deadliest stage whisper. Now let's glide over to 1918. World War I is dragging on, soldiers are knee-deep in trenches, and then nature decides to drop a sequel nobody asked for, the Spanish flu. Despite the name, it didn't actually start in Spain. The country was just neutral during the war, so its press was freer to report on the outbreak. Meanwhile, countries like Britain, France, and the U.S. were censoring news to keep morale up. So everyone assumed Spain was ground zero, which is classic. Blame the guy who's just being honest. The flu hit in 3 waves between 1918 and 1919, and it didn't just target the very old or very young like most flus. Nope. This one went after healthy young adults, ages 20 to 40, soldiers, workers, parents. which meant it cut right into the backbone of society. Victims often developed cyanosis, their skin turning blue from lack of oxygen, lungs filled with fluid. Death could come in a matter of days. And the numbers? Somewhere between 50 and 100 million dead worldwide. That's more than the war itself. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Coffins ran out. In Philadelphia, bodies piled up in the streets awaiting burial. Cities banned gatherings, closed theaters, and even outlawed spitting, which, shocking, should really be a law all the time. The weird part, once the pandemic ended, people kind of stopped talking about it. Historians sometimes call it the forgotten flu. Overshadowed by the war, by the roaring 20s, by everyone's general desire to never think about phlegm again. And yet, if you compare it to modern pandemics, it makes even COVID look like a dress rehearsal, which is both terrifying and, if you're half asleep, maybe oddly comforting. Because hey, humanity survived that one too. Let's float back a bit. The third plague pandemic. Just in case you thought the plague retired after the Middle Ages, nope. Our old friend Yersinia pestis made another comeback in the late 19th century in what's called the Third Plague Pandemic. It began in China in the 1850s, spreading to India, and then basically everywhere the British Empire had shipping routes, which unfortunately was everywhere. This time it killed over 12 million people, mostly in India and China. The plague even reached ports in the U.S. San Francisco had outbreaks in the early 1900s. Local authorities tried to downplay it because tourism, and that always works out so well. By now, doctors were starting to figure things out. Alexander Yersin identified the bacteria itself in 1894, which is why it's called Yersinia pestis. Rats and fleas were finally outed as the culprits. Quarantine stations popped up, and slowly the plague faded. But it never truly went away. Even today, a few dozen people a year still catch plague, usually in rural parts of Africa or the American Southwest. Don't worry, antibiotics can handle it now. Unless you're trying to be edgy and LARP as a 14th century peasant, you'll probably be fine. Typhus, the prison and war special. Another frequent flyer in history's pandemic portfolio is typhus, not to be confused with typhoid fever. Typhus is spread by lice, thrives in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, and historically popped up wherever humans decided to do something reckless, like fight wars or lock thousands of people into prisons. In the Napoleonic Wars, typhus cut down soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. During the retreat from Moscow in 1812, disease killed far more men than the Russian winter did. Same with World War I prison camps and World War II ghettos. Basically, if humans cram themselves together in misery, typhus RSVP'd. Symptoms included high fever, delirium, and a nasty rash. Mortality rates could hit 40%. And in the pre-antibiotic era, there wasn't much you could do, except shave everyone's heads and hope lice lost interest, which is not the most glamorous strategy, but hey, it kind of worked. IVH, AIDS, the modern pandemic. Now let's drift into the late 19th century. Unlike the fast and flashy pandemics of the past, IVH AIDS has been a slow, relentless one. First recognized in the early 1980s, it spread rapidly among certain communities, and stigma made it so much worse. At first, governments hesitated to even acknowledge it, which feels eerily familiar, doesn't it? But the virus didn't care about politics. By the mid-1990s, AIDS was the leading cause of death for adults under 50 in many parts of the world. Globally, over 40 million people have died from IVH-related illnesses since the beginning, and tens of millions more live with it today. Unlike cholera or plague, IVH never comes and goes in waves. It's just there, a permanent part of human life for over 40 years now. The difference is treatment has changed everything. Antiretroviral therapy can suppress the virus, letting people live long, relatively normal lives. It's not eradicated, but it's controlled, which, if history tells us anything, is already a miracle compared to the centuries of helplessness our ancestors had. A short breather, because that was heavy. Okay, let's just pause here. Inhale, exhale. We've drifted from dirty water to blue-skinned flu victims to modern virology. It's a lot. And yet, it all kind of blends into one long story. Humans building cities, trading goods, going to war, and then germs hitching a ride every single time. And it's funny, in that dark way, that so much of history's drama boils down to tiny organisms we can't even see. Kings fought wars, armies marched, empires collapsed, and then boom, a flea, a louse, a virus molecule. Curtain call. Malaria, the eternal companion. Before we wrap this section, we should nod to malaria. Not a sudden pandemic, but a constant background hum of death throughout human history. Caused by parasites carried by mosquitoes, malaria has killed more people than perhaps any single disease ever. Ancient China. Hey there, still awake? Or maybe half asleep? Which is exactly the point. Let's keep floating forward. We've wandered through the medieval rat parades, the cholera fountains of the 19th century, and the forgotten flu of 1918. Now it's time to settle into the more recent history of pandemics. The ones we might actually remember living through, which is always fun bedtime material. So, tuck in. Tonight's lullabies feature SARS, Ebola, COVID-19, and a few modern reminders that germs still haven't retired. SARS, a dry run for global panic. Our first stop is the year 2002, the early 2000s, low-rise jeans, flip phones, and the sudden emergence of a little thing called SARS. That stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, caused by a coronavirus. Yes, the same family as COVID. Think of it as the awkward older sibling. It started in southern China, likely jumping from bats to civet cats to humans. Because nature really loves improvising with animal-to-human handoffs. By early 2003, it had spread internationally. Over 8,000 cases across 29 countries, with about 774 deaths. Now, compared to the Black Death, those numbers sound like a rounding error. But what made SARS memorable was the fear factor. Hospitals were scrambling. Cities like Toronto basically shut down. Thermal scanners popped up in airports, and for the first time, global media covered every case in real time. Luckily, SARS had one big weakness. Once people got sick, they got sick fast, which meant you could identify, isolate, and contain them before they spread it further. By mid-2003, the outbreak was declared over. No vaccine, no miracle cure, just plain old quarantine doing its thing. So, in hindsight, SARS was like a global fire drill. Humanity got a test run. Spoiler alert, we didn't exactly ace the follow-up exam in 2020. Ebola, the horror movie virus. Now, while we're floating through the 2010s, let's mention Zika, because why let malaria have all the mosquito attention? Zika had been quietly circulating for decades, But in 2015-2016, it suddenly exploded in the Americas. It's usually mild, fever, rash, joint pain. But the kicker was its link to severe birth defects, particularly microcephaly in newborns. That changed the tone completely. Suddenly, entire countries were issuing travel advisories. Pregnant women were told to avoid certain regions. Mosquito control campaigns went into overdrive. And once again, everyone was reminded that the tiniest insects can derail entire societies. Luckily, Zika faded almost as quickly as it rose. Outbreaks dwindled after 2017, but for a while, it was the disease of the week. Proof that pandemics don't always need mass death to cause mass disruption. Sometimes, just the idea of risk is enough to keep people up at night. COVID-19, the pandemic we all got as a souvenir, or dreaded, or maybe just tired of hearing about. You know the story. Late 2019, reports emerge of a mysterious pneumonia in Wuhan, China. By early 2020, it was everywhere. Borders closed, flights canceled, supermarkets stripped of toilet paper, because apparently humanity's first instinct in a crisis is to panic buy Charmin. Caused by a novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, COVID spread fast, really fast. And unlike SARS in 2003, this virus had a nasty habit of being contagious before people showed symptoms, which made containment basically impossible. By March 2020, the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic. Within months, cases were in nearly every country on Earth. Cities went into lockdown, entire economies froze. Zoom became everyone's second home, and millions died. As of now, estimates suggest over 20 million excess deaths worldwide in the first few years, direct and indirect. Some countries fared better, some worse, but no one escaped untouched. On the bright side, and yes, there is one, vaccines were developed in record time. mRNA technology went from sci-fi dream to billions of doses in arms in under a year, which is pretty astounding considering it once took centuries to figure out don't drink from the sewer. COVID isn't gone. It's become part of the background noise of life, like flu. But the pandemic phase, that sense of global emergency, is slowly fading. Historians of the future will probably look back at 2020 the way we look at 1347 or 1918, a year when everything stopped, when fear was everywhere, and when people coped in strange ways. Banana bread, Tiger King, toilet paper hoarding, truly a cultural time capsule. Honorable mentions, because germs never stop RSVPing. Let's not forget a few other modern outbreaks that deserve at least a sleepy nod. H1N1 swine flu. H1N1 swine flu. It spread fast, infected millions, but turned out to be less deadly than feared. Basically the pandemic equivalent of a movie trailer that oversold itself. MERS, 2012. Another coronavirus, mostly in the Middle East, with a high fatality rate but limited spread. Proof that sometimes viruses just don't have the social skills. Avian flu, H5N1, H7N9. Occasionally jumps from birds to humans, rare but with terrifying fatality rates. Scientists worry about it constantly because birds are everywhere, and so is poop. Monkeypox, now Mpox. 2022 saw it jump into the spotlight, mostly spreading outside Africa for the first time. Less deadly, but another reminder that pandemics don't need passports. Each of these is a little post-it note on the fridge of history, reminding us pandemics are not a thing of the past. They're ongoing, they're evolving, they're unfortunately kind of permanent house guests. The weird irony of it all. So as we drift here at the end of part 3, what's the pattern? Every age thinks it's unique. Medieval peasants thought the plague was the end of the world. Romans thought their empire was collapsing under divine punishment. We thought COVID was the big one. But in reality, it's all variations on the same theme. Germs find people, people make it worse. Eventually, people adapt. Sometimes we invent vaccines, sometimes we just shrug and carry on. The irony is that pandemics, while devastating, often accelerate change. Public health systems, sanitation, vaccination, even economic shifts. If history was a video game, pandemics would be the badly designed level that still unlocks new features once you survive it. Drifting toward sleep. And with that, let's take another long, slow breath. We've wandered through SARS, Ebola, Zika, and COVID. We've seen how modern science responds and how society freaks out in oddly predictable ways. Pandemics aren't going away, but maybe, just maybe, we're getting a little better at surviving them. Or at least writing sarcastic bedtime history monologues about them, which is something. So rest easy tonight. Your bed is clean, your water is filtered, and no plague doctor in a crow mask is hovering over you. Unless you're into that. In which case, no judgment. Hey again. Still here? Or maybe drifting in and out? That's fine. That's kind of the whole point. Tonight, we've wandered through thousands of years of pandemics, from ancient Athens to COVID memes. And now, in this last part, let's just float a little slower, a little softer. We'll wrap up the story of humanity's relationship with germs, a relationship we never asked for, but somehow can't escape. So, deep breath. Let's settle into the epilogue.